Le plan aujourd'hui, on va demander à nos panélistes, très heureuse d'avoir plusieurs collègues anciennes recrues du RLP avec nous aujourd'hui, de se présenter, de parler un peu de leur entrée au gouvernement par le biais du RLP, puis de leur parcours aussi avant. Et puis ensuite, on va garder du temps pour les questions-réponses. Donc, vous pouvez à n'importe quel moment commencer à poser vos questions dans le fond, dans la boîte, si vous voulez. So the plan for today, I'm really happy to have so many of my RPL colleagues who are from science backgrounds themselves or working in different capacities in science policy in the federal government. So everyone will introduce themselves and tell you a bit more about their backgrounds, and then we'll keep plenty of time for Q's and A's. So without further ado, I'll ask Amanda to start us off. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm going to do my intro in English, but as Letitia was saying, we'll try to answer questions in either language. So my name is Amanda Weingardner, and I work at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, FO. I first started working with the Government of Canada in 2016, and then I accessed a position through RPL in 2018. So prior to the working for the government, I had done both an MSc and a PhD in biology, mostly focused on freshwater aquatic ecology. And the position that I came into using RPL was one of a senior science advisor in DFO's science sector. And part of the job that I have in that position was standing up a new national freshwater habitat fish science program after the most recent changes from the Fisheries Act. And that's actually still my current substantive position, but I have also been acting as a national manager since April for two of other DFO scientist program, the National Contaminants Advisory Group, which focuses on contaminants and effects on aquatic organisms, and the Multi-Partner Research Initiative, which focuses on oil spill cleanup science and technologies in marine systems. So I actually applied to RPL twice. The first time I was not successful, which is very common for people, just so you know, and I was successful the second time. And when I applied the second time, I had actually been working for government already for about a year for what was then Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada as a water management specialist. So I did have some government experience after my PhD before coming into RPL. And Letitia asked us to talk a little bit about how we sort of parlayed our science background for the RPL process in terms of demonstrating academic excellence and policy experience, et cetera. And I think for me, some of the things that I was able to do is that I was able to demonstrate that even though I had a science background and was doing scientific research, I also had interests and time spent engaging with policy and with policymakers. So while I was a PhD student, I had done some side projects with PhD students in other domains like political science, social science, and we had done some analysis and published some papers on legislative changes to what was then the Navigable Waters Protection Act, but from the sort of perspective of what that meant for freshwater science in Canada. And so those types of papers led to opportunities to present evidence at parliamentary committees and also engage sort of in the policymaking cycle that way. Also, because I did, and the second time I applied, have some experience working for government, I was able to demonstrate how using science and running scientific programs was then useful for me to engage with senior managers and work and provide information for decision making. And I also made sure to highlight some job experience that I had that was completely outside of the policy realm, but that went towards leadership and communication skills. So I had other job experience where I worked, for example, as an emergency responder and a 911 dispatcher, and I was able to talk about how that also allowed me to make contributions to leadership and to my community and develop communication skills. So not everything I highlighted in my application was purely based on science or policy as well. So it's important to remember those other things. And just one final thing before it goes to the next person that I'll just mention as sort of a tip that I think will be recapped later in French is that it's important to remember that when you're doing your application, it's not necessarily going to be reviewed by someone in your field. And I think that's especially important for scientists that are talking from maybe a very niche field, like theoretical physics or something like that. So it's really important when you're talking about your contributions that you explain why something's a significant contribution. Don't assume that your reviewers will know that the article that you submitted to a top journal in physics is a top journal in physics, for example. So you have to provide that context for people recognizing that they might not have your same background. I think that's it. Hopefully that wasn't too long.
Oh, that's great. Alors, on a Amanda qui est en biologie en ce moment à Pêche et Océan Canada, en fait. Et puis, l'espèce de conseil numéro 1 pour les applications qu'elle a partagé ici, c'est vraiment de ne pas prendre pour acquis que le lecteur ou l'évaluateur va être familier avec votre champ d'expertise quand vous postulez au RLP. Par exemple, si vous avez des publications dans le journal qui est vraiment le top en physique quantique, c'est probable que la personne qui révise votre application en aura aucune idée. Donc, n'hésitez pas à l'expliquer puis à nous donner un peu plus de contexte là, pour être sûr qu'on puisse évaluer vos compétences au mieux. Alors, j'aimerais qu'on se tourne vers Rajat, please, if you don't mind.
Hi, my name is Rajat Ghosh. I work for the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada in the science and research sector. Currently, I work in a directorate focusing on innovation policy and any type of policy related to emerging technologies. So before joining the federal government, I received a PhD in quantum physics from Princeton University. I'd helped start up 2 companies related to quantum sensors. Afterwards, we'd actually engaged the US government, Department of the Navy, to give policy advice. I've also worked in consulting, both for US government, but also for Fortune 500 companies. And finally, I was in academia. I kind of got lured to government because some of the people I had worked with were high up in the US administration in science policy, and seemed like a path, and seemed like there was a real dearth of knowledge. It seemed like there's an actual need and a gap. So I really thought that, maybe my experience might be better served doing something for the public good as opposed to, spending time satisfying my own intellectual interests. So there are a number of things to actually consider when you're actually writing your application. First off, when you're coming in with a PhD, at least what I've noticed or what I've experienced, is that it doesn't really, the people who are hiring you are hiring you not necessarily always just for your expertise, but just for some sort of base level of achievement. So for instance, yes, if you're a quantum physicist, departments that are interested in quantum physics will be very interested to hire you. Other departments such as finance or fisheries might look at you and say, well, that's a very difficult subject. So we might be interested in hiring someone with a lot of analytical thinking capabilities and critical thinking capabilities. So it's important, depending on what your interests are, to be able to market yourself quite broadly. The things that I would highlight that managers are really interested in looking at me, and I think that really guided me through the application process, was really highlighting my policy experience. And it doesn't have to be the same for everyone. I know some people have worked directly in policy. Some people worked in lobbyists. So, there's different ways to do it. Another thing which carried over really well was any experience you have in leadership positions or any leadership activities that you had engaged in. I think that's something that when you're coming into government, the big difference from academia that I noticed is that in academia, they're often small teams, not always, but in government, to get anything moving, you need large collaborations of people working together. So that's really a skill that you want to highlight. Highlighting consulting work was useful, and really being able to show that you're a good communicator, because the one stereotype I encountered is that hiring managers would look at scientists and really be wary about whether they could communicate properly, in a written context. And I think we all know that's, really not fair, considering we all have to write these 200-page theses and papers and articles every, I mean, not to say that those papers and articles are actually decipherable by anybody anyway, but the point is that's really something that I would suggest stressing. And I think that's really the top tips from me.
Wonderful. Donc, juste pour résumer les conseils principaux de Rajat en français. Alors, peut-être que vous avez un doctorat, une expertise très pointue, mais il faut garder en tête que vous allez peut-être être intéressant pour des gestionnaires d'embauche au-delà de ça. Donc, pas seulement pour votre expertise pointue, mais pour les autres compétences qui viennent avec ça, donc vos capacités d'analyse, puis vraiment de canaliser l'information et peut-être aussi vos capacités de communication, d'être capable de travailler sur ces sujets-là difficiles. Puis Rajat soulignait aussi que le gouvernement a quand même une grande structure. Donc, des fois, on a des petites équipes au niveau académique, mais ici, il y a beaucoup d'initiatives, de projets qui vont demander la collaboration de plusieurs équipes à travers différents ministères. Donc, tout ce qui est de votre expertise, oui, en politique publique, mais aussi en leadership, puis en mobilisation, collaboration, c'est des compétences qui peuvent être très appréciées au gouvernement. Donc, Rachat est à Innovation, Sciences et Développement économique Canada en politique scientifique. Et puis, Margot.
Hi there. My name is Margot Rasik. I am a senior policy analyst at Environment and Climate Change Canada. I'm a relatively new recruit to the program. This is my first position through the RPL program, and I've actually been on maternity leave for the last year, so I'm about to start back in a few weeks. So yeah, I think I've been through it quite recently, which is might be helpful for anyone with questions going through it now. Not like the other participants, I do not have a PhD. I didn't actually know that so many people with a science background did have PhDs. I went to veterinary school and got a joint master's in public health at the same time and graduated in 2016. And then when I left school, I had quite a passionate interest in school about farm animals and the use of antibiotics in farm animals. And that led me into a background in policy that I wasn't even necessarily intending. I ended up leaving vet school and working for 2 years at the World Organization for Animal Health, which is like the WHO, but for animals. And so they do a lot of, it's an intergovernmental organization, and they do a lot of policy work trying to get countries to agree, basically in consensus about how things should be done worldwide. So one thing that I did as part of that job, I was actually hired on a more technical level. It wasn't really policy at the beginning, but one thing I really tried to stress in my application to the RPL program was that eventually my role really became about translating some of the research I was doing for them in order to be understood. I did presentations for all the countries at our world forums. I ended up representing the organization on a UN subcommittee on the issue. And so my role really did transition over time. That's what made me interested in the RPL program and to work more purely on policy. At the same time, I also was getting a bit burnt out on the issue that I had suddenly become an expert in. And I actually sort of used the RPL program as a way to continue working in policy, but start to work on a different issue. I actually found it to be really helpful for that. I think, as Rajat said, you can really highlight a lot of the skills that you've gained, but not necessarily pigeonhole yourself into the same sort of issues you've been working on in the past. It's an amazing opportunity to, I wouldn't say completely reinvent yourself, but try to explain how your skills can be leveraged for just analytical thinking in a different position and working on a different topic. So the RPL program was really helpful for me for that. And when I did my application, I really emphasized that in school I had always been interested in policy, that I had organized many seminars on campus and brought different researchers to campus. I had done many externships with the US government where I was studying. And so I had some small opportunities there to sort of contribute to policy and do some research that led to some policy developments, which was helpful. And what else? And yeah, so that was successful for me, and I have really enjoyed my time in the government so far. I work in the Science and Technology Policy branch of Environment Canada, so I think I might be one of the only veterinarians in the organization, but it's been a really interesting experience. I don't work right now on topics directly related to animals. I think I was a bit surprised to see that there are many people working in science policy who do not have science backgrounds. And so I actually found that my ability to understand and digest science was tremendously helpful for my team. And I really enjoyed the position. So that's the background on me. So I would highlight the same tips that were given by others to not limit yourself to your area of expertise and try as much as you can to demonstrate how your experience has led you to be really an expert translator of science into policy.
Super, merci. Donc, Margot est passée d'un parcours comme vétérinaire, en fait, à un poste plus en politique à l'Organisation mondiale pour la santé des animaux. Puis ensuite, par le biais du RLP, a pu étendre son champ d'expertise, là, maintenant, en environnement et changement climatique Canada, dans un poste en politique de sciences et technologies. Donc, encore une fois, on a eu comme cet encouragement-là à vraiment élargir vos horizons aussi, puis à insister dans votre application sur votre capacité à prendre des connaissances scientifiques, puis à les traduire pour un auditoire plus large, puis aussi à les traduire pour les politiques publiques au point de vue d'amener des changements ou des recommandations de politique. Et Sean,
bonsoir tout le monde. Mon nom est Sean McGurk. Je suis actuellement conseiller principal en politique au CRSNG, le Conseil de recherche en sciences naturelles et en génie du Canada. Je vais faire le reste de ma réponse en anglais, puisque je suis un peu plus habitué. I'm Sean McGurk. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. I'll actually start with my top tip because it kind of aligns with what everybody has said already, that you really can't assume that the people that are going to review your application are in the same field as you. So you need to really market yourself in a way that somebody who really isn't familiar with your field would really understand the skills that you can bring into the public service. So kind of in that vein, it's important to really pull out what was significant about the experience that you took a part of. And especially if you say that you've developed a skill, if you can say how you've applied it in a different kind of way, that shows that you can really transfer the skills that you learned from one field to another. So going from there, my background is in cancer research, specifically on breast cancer metabolism and resistance to chemotherapy. And throughout my PhD, I became involved in science policy through a group called Science and Policy Exchange, which is a nonprofit based in Montreal, but that is Canada-wide. And through that, I organized quite a few science policy public forums and did quite a bit of advocacy at the provincial and federal levels, including for the Fundamental Science Review in 2017 with a large group of other students who have, for the most part, found their way into the public service through one way or another. And another one actually got into the RPL last year as well. So I applied to the RPL program in 2017 at the same time as applying for the MyTech Science Policy Fellowship program, which is another way to get into the public service. And the RPL program takes, the process is quite long. So I actually applied to the Science Policy Fellowship second and ended up getting into that and accepting the position before I found out I got into the RPL pool. So after my one-year fellowship was done at NSERC, I used the RPL to jump to a higher position, essentially from an analyst to a senior policy advisor position, where I now work mostly on research excellence and research integrity policies. And for the last however many months we've been in this pandemic, scanning the impact of COVID-19 on the research ecosystem more broadly. So that's me.
Donc, peut-être juste pour dire quelques mots sur le programme en général, là, avant de bouger aux questions. Donc, vous pouvez soumettre vos questions là, sur le menu de questions-réponses. Alors, pour le RLP, les exigences sont les mêmes que vous soyez scientifique ou de n'importe quel domaine. Donc, on n'est pas restreint à aucun domaine. Vous devez minimalement avoir une maîtrise ou un doctorat, peu importe le domaine, un ou l'autre, même si c'est niveau maîtrise, c'est parfaitement convenable, ou bien diplôme en droit avec un autre baccalauréat, moins pertinent pour la session d'aujourd'hui. Et puis, vous devez vraiment répondre à 3 choses, nous montrer que vous avez des preuves d'excellence académique, d'expérience pertinente en politique et puis le troisième de leadership, d'implication dans la communauté. Donc ça, c'est vraiment 3 qualifications essentielles. Si vous en manque un, c'est peu probable que la RPL soit vraiment une option pour vous. Si vous voulez plus d'informations aussi sur le programme en général, on a d'autres sessions webinaires là, plus sur le processus et le fonctionnement. On a aussi du contenu là, sur YouTube, donc on vous invite à regarder ça pour essayer de concentrer le plus possible à utiliser l'expérience de nos participants aujourd'hui là, du côté scientifique. So just a few words quickly on the program in general. So the RPL requires, well, basically the standards are the same no matter the background you're coming from. So candidates need minimally a master's or a PhD in any discipline, one or the other, master's degree just fine, or law degree with another undergraduate degree, less relevant here. And then the 3 essential qualifications or criteria that you need to meet for the initial application stage are academic excellence. So we need external markers of your academic excellence, either through scholarships or publications or different combinations of the 2. The second one is policy relevant experience. So you do need to be able to show some policy relevant experience. So not necessarily strictly speaking policy experience in government, but it can be through other activities, extracurriculars, where you've actually bridged your science background into policy in some ways, in some capacity. And the third one is leadership and community involvement. So really we need people to be able to demonstrate that they've been involved and have had an impact in their community in various ways. It's interpreted quite broadly. That said, those 3 are really the main criteria. So if you don't meet one of those, it's likely that RPL might not be the best vehicle for you to enter the federal public service. So if you have questions on the more general functioning of the program, we do have some YouTube videos online covering those. We also have more general webinars. So to make the most of our panelists' expertise, we're going to try to stick to science-focused questions today. So you can submit your questions and we'll start. Perhaps we'll go in the same order. Amanda, I know you flagged a few that you'd like to take. So.
Yeah, sure. Now, which ones were they? I think the first one was, there was a question about what made the key difference between the first time I applied and the second time that I applied. And of course, I can't say for sure because I didn't evaluate my own application, but I can sort of offer some guesses. I think one thing was, just as I said at the beginning and other people have reiterated, was I think the first time I applied, I did focus more on sort of listing all my experiences and putting them less in the context as to why those are relevant for policy. And so when I applied the second time, I really focused on making sure that it was understood, that the impact of what I had done was understood, and there was sort of that field like context. And I made sure to talk about, as I think Margaret was saying, it's not just policy experience you might have, but things you might have done that are relevant to policy, such as translating knowledge, communication, et cetera. So I focused more on situating and I think putting some context around my experiences. And the second thing, I think it did help that I just had another year and a bit of experience working outside of an academic setting as well. So by the time I applied the second time, I had entered government. And so I just had an understanding a little bit more about how information is used in decision-making. And I could talk a bit more about those experiences. That's obviously not a requirement. You don't need to work for government before you apply to RPL, but I do think that probably added a little bit to my application as well. So that was the first question. And then I think the other one that I flagged was, someone had asked how relevant or how much do you fall back on your specific subject matter expertise from a master's or a PhD? And I'll answer from my perspective, but others might have thoughts on this as well. I would say one thing with myself or my position, while I would say it's sort of policy adjacent, I think that I actually work much more sort of at the interface between research and DFO and that policy. So I work much more in like a strategic planning and knowledge translation type role. And I would say for the first position that I started with RPL, where I was working on standing up a freshwater habitat science program, that aligned very well with my background. And so I was very much using, you know, what I knew about the field and what I knew about landscape for doing that. But in my current position, where I'm managing some programs, that content matter is, I think, less important. And what's more important is my understanding of how science operates, what scientists need in order to be effective and how we can facilitate good science, and how to work sort of that interface between what our client sectors need in terms of science advice and what scientists need to know in order to answer those questions and do research. So I think it's much more about understanding the scientific process and understanding the scientific landscape. And then of course, also understanding government decision-making and other factors that go into decision-making. So I think depending on the position, your subject matter expertise could be very important, or just having that sort of well-rounded understanding of the scientific process may be the more important thing, but it does depend on the position you end up in.
Great. Rajat, I think you had flagged one about what skills will be the most important.
Just before getting to that, though, I'll just tag on, dovetail from what Amanda said. Yeah, so at least from my first position in government, I didn't use any of my subject matter expertise. Just talking about, I was thinking a lot about large scale research infrastructure, a few programs that got wound down. So that's never really the most pleasant thing. Although where I work currently, I'm using the knowledge I acquired doing my PhD and beyond almost every day to help translate basically what emerging technologies are and their impacts for government. But to move on to the next question, what skills do you think are the most important for a policy career? So for me, I think the one thing that I've noticed, it's really important to highlight what the barriers, gaps, and issues are for any scientific initiative. Now, that could be anything. Like, for instance, let's say we're talking about quantum technologies. Part of it could be financing. Part of it could be talent development. If you actually if you're trying to use science or develop new technologies, it's still nascent. Do you actually have the requisite highly qualified people and talent to fill that sector? Or are you just wasting time? Is that a barrier? Are there security implications of what you're building? If so, should we deem it a key industrial capability? Should we keep it in-house? Is it cheaper perhaps to outsource this and actually get technology from like-minded nations? Are we generating IP? Is that IP safe? Should we be using open science and actually publishing all of our results in a scientific field? Or is there a fear that some of that IP could be poached by a foreign country? So there's a lot of issues that that come up, and I think these are the types of things that if you put not just only having expertise in your field, but actually having put some serious thought to these issues are really what will help you in a policy career. I think it's important to know that you're not an advocate. I can't stress it enough. You're a neutral broker that's analyzing for the government. If you're coming in as a PhD biochemist, that's great. But there are many applications. There's many things the government's considering. They're considering AI, they're considering climate change. So you kind of have to, in this weird context, analyze things neutrally, even if in the past you're an advocate. You need to have a strong ability to communicate to people at all levels. And that can be someone that, has a master's degree. It can even be someone that has a high school degree. And you have to do an equally good job of being high level enough, getting to the real major point while glossing over the details that aren't really necessary towards making a decision. Third thing, like I've said this before, but teamwork is imperative. In science, in some fields, you can just work on your own. Large efforts in the government are always collaborative. Even if you're just an analyst working on a specific project, you likely have to interact with your director general. If you're getting something funded, the analyst in finance. If you have to write, if that does go forward, something for the MC, you have to interact with PCO. So there are many different layers of communication. You have to be able to resell the same idea or be able to translate and communicate effectively to broad audiences. But to answer the second part of your question, one is able to acquire most of these skills during your PhD or during advanced studies. And they might need some refinement because you're going to have to translate that to another mode of thinking. But I like to think of it like this. If you've ever written a grant, a memorandum to cabinet is really like the first 2 or 3 pages of your grant. And the Treasury Board submission is really the annex to your grant application. So the skills do translate. And I know in science, you have a lot of abilities to work with a lot of people. You have a lot of time and opportunities to go to conferences and speak about very dense technical subjects to people that might not be in your field. So I think you have a lot of that experience and you're well placed to do it. It's just a matter of throwing in that policy lens and just refining it a little.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Margot, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I saw someone asked a question about how many years of work experience are required. I didn't understand that there was a requirement. I chose to answer this question because I had very few years of work experience when I applied to the program. So I just wanted to say I wouldn't be discouraged. I think I had 2 years of solid work experience as well as externships throughout my degree. And so I would consider that to be not very much work experience. However, they were very relevant to policy. I think in my case, it benefited me that I could demonstrate that throughout my degree, I was very interested in policy. And that happened for me very organically. It wasn't really my goal to work in policy, but I think if you are in your field and you can reflect on how certain government policies have affected your ability to do research or the applicability of your research in larger society, then these are all things that you can reflect on and find ways to participate in to gain relevant policy experience, and sort of start small that way. I only got the job that I got out of vet school because I demonstrated that I had done quite a bit of research and engagement during my degree. So it all sort of built up over time. I see that there are some people asking, do you need policy experience to be in this, to apply to this program? My understanding is yes. I don't think that it needs to be as clear cut as I worked for government for 5 years or I contributed to this specific policy. I think it's up to you to demonstrate that, what are the larger societal implications of the work that you've done, and what can you reflect on to demonstrate that that's something that you have been thoughtful about and have made efforts to contribute to. And there are many ways to do that, that aren't just proving that you worked for government or some other organization for a short period of time. So I would urge you to be creative, but still really reflect on, whether or not the work you've done so far has had those implications and whether that is of interest to you. Because when you do take a policy job, it is pure policy. That has been my experience. I know some people say that they're doing slightly more technical stuff. My job is pure policy. And so if you are coming from a science background and the analytical work of policy is not that interesting to you, then I would urge you to consider whether or not this is the right fit for you, because that is the majority of what people will want you to do when you work for government. So I would think about it from those angles as well.
Great, thank you. And others have asked for more concrete details or examples about what we look for. So I just direct you to the job poster, so the actual offer with all the details. So it gives a bit more avenues. We're not super prescriptive because we want to be open to different ways of meeting that criteria, but it's basically relevant policy experience, either in economic, political, legal, scientific fields, either through professional experience, through conducting research and doing studies, presentations. You just need a hook there in how your pure research would actually translate or have policy recommendations, not just in the abstract sense that they could have policy implications, almost everything does in life, but how your research specifically, how you've sort of bridged that gap towards implementation and other leadership experiences. So either through your research or through all sorts of different experiences, paid employment within governments, but also in other contexts. So there's a bit more detail on the job poster. So on that note, I'll turn it to Sean.
Yeah, I was going to add directly to that. There was a lot of questions about what counts as policy work. It doesn't have to just be public policy. Policies everywhere. Universities have policies. Companies have policies. All of the policy, I'm going to call it policy adjacent work that I did before getting into RPL was all the nonprofit side. So yeah, it really just depends on how you want to sell it. I'm trying to see all the questions that I marked the answer, but they're jumping all over the place. So I'll just maybe go from the top. Monica asked about some advice on the second and third phases of the application, so the written phase and the interview phase. On that, I mean, for the written phase, you will get some instructions when it comes to that. I would say, you know, you have an allocated amount of time to do that assignment, and I would recommend taking those days off of whatever your current job or study is so that you can really focus on it. I know that I needed it for sure. And reading up on how to write a good briefing note at that point is very helpful. There's a lot of really good references to that on the federal government websites, but also elsewhere. For the interview, it really just is trying to make sure that you stay calm. It is a pressure interview. It changes every year, so you can't really give very specific advice, but make sure that you know government priorities, you know, read the federal budget, read the actual list of government priorities, which is available on the federal government websites. And if you don't know how to answer a particular question, try to frame it from the knowledge that you have. If your knowledge of policy is limited to a very specific field, you can try to answer from your perspective and try to build on that as you try to answer your question. So just try to really just take it one step at a time and don't panic. There was another question about policy work in terms of whether advocacy at the university level for advocating for women in STEM or increased representation of diverse voices is considered policy work. Yes, potentially. It could also be considered community or leadership work. It depends all on how you frame it. Given that diversity and inclusion is a very major priority of the federal government, or at least of the current federal government, I would definitely count that as relevant experience in that sense. Il y avait une question en français aussi, disant que les présenteurs, présentrices sont principalement anglophones, et si le taux de réussite d'un dossier en français est différent qu'un dossier en anglais, Laetitia peut peut-être confirmer, mais cette année, les entrevues que j'ai faites étaient plus en français. Il y avait un taux de succès quand même assez élevé, je pense similaire à ceux qui ont été faits en anglais. Vous pouvez vraiment appliquer dans la langue que vous voulez. Il va y avoir des évaluateurs anglophones, francophones et bilingues à tous les stages de la compétition. Donc, vraiment participer dans la langue dans laquelle vous êtes le plus confortable. There was one last question specifically for me, which was coming from a STEM background. Would the MyTex or the RPL program better suit someone that doesn't have policy experience beyond the level of student government? It depends. I would say the MyTex program selection criteria are lighter than the RPL. Because it is like a one-year internship that is meant for you to get experience in policy rather than being admitted into kind of a high-level pool, which can then get you a direct permanent job in policy. So I would just try to read up directly on those two programs on their respective websites. And if you'd like to connect with me on the side, I'd be glad to talk to you about either of the programs.
Donc, juste, oui, j'allais faire un rappel justement. En ce moment, on prend les questions puis on répond dans la langue où la question a été posée, mais gênez-vous pas, les francophones sur l'appel. La plupart de nos panélistes comprennent quand même s'ils étaient plus à l'aise de faire leur introduction en anglais. Donc, il n'y a aucun problème si vous voulez diriger vos questions aussi à nos différents panélistes. Puis pour ce qui est du taux de réussite ou même du processus, des fois, on se fait demander est-ce que c'est mieux de remplir l'application en anglais pour montrer qu'on a une compétence en anglais? Pas du tout, c'est vraiment libre à vous. Peu importe la langue dans laquelle vous complétez votre application ou l'examen écrit ou même la langue que vous désirez pour l'entrevue, votre panel va être formé de gens qui sont complètement à l'aise dans cette langue-là ou les gens qui vont corriger l'examen, la même chose. Donc, le taux de succès est similaire, puis il n'y a pas de différence dans le fond dans l'évaluation qui est faite. Donc, c'est vraiment libre à vous. Puis aussi, ça permet de préciser aussi, il n'y a pas nécessairement d'exigence d'être bilingue dès le départ pour avoir un poste au fédéral. Donc, c'est possible d'avoir un poste qui est unilingue. Par contre, là où le bilinguisme devient de plus en plus important au fil de la progression de carrière, parce que chaque employé peut travailler dans la langue de son choix. Donc, dès qu'on arrive à un niveau de chef d'équipe ou de gestionnaire, là, c'est plus important d'être capable de gérer son équipe dans la langue du choix des employés. So just a quick note on bilingualism. So it's not essential to take a position in the federal government. So feel free to apply, do every assessment in the language of your choice. And then if you don't speak both official languages, that's fine. It will, though, become more and more important for career progression. So because every federal government employee can work and be supervised in the language of their choice. If you rise towards team leader or manager positions, then there will be an expectation that you'll be able to manage the team in the language of your employees choosing. But for a start, it's not a requirement. So I guess we've done one full circle. We might go back to Amanda.
Yeah, sure. Like Sean, I'm just trying to keep track of what questions I said I would answer. They keep moving. So there was one question that I saw. So someone was asking about when you're presenting information in your application, does that information you put in sort of dictate what type of position you would end up in? So if you focus on scientific experience or technical skills, will you end up in kind of a technical position versus if you focus on policy, will you end up in a policy analyst position? And I guess it's important to emphasize that so the application process you go through is not for a specific position. It's to get into this sort of RPL inventory or RPL pool. So you really want to provide information and answers to the questions in your application that will answer the questions in the application and demonstrate your experience on those different things you need. So academic excellence, the policy related experience, leadership and community development, for example. And obviously what you choose to emphasize, will be maybe a factor, in some of the other sort of application steps. But what if you're successful getting into that inventory, what happens then is your CV and a profile will basically be generated, will be posted on a website, will be circulated around, and you'll work with a mentor who will be an RPL alumni to look for positions. So they'll help you scope out, okay, what type of position am I looking for? What are some target departments or teams that I might want to look for positions in? And so I wouldn't say that your initial application will pigeonhole you into a particular type of position. And in fact, sometimes you might have someone who comes into the process and has a very firm idea about what type of position they want. But then once they start looking around and talking to hiring managers, they may go in a different direction and realize, oh, actually, this is very interesting to me. And so they'll use their skills to go into that type of position. So what you put on that initial application will not necessarily put you into one particular position or box. I think it's more important to demonstrate that sort of well-roundedness. The other question was, someone was just asking about, what does your day-to-day work look like? And I think this is a good question just because we're talking a lot of, RPL is called a recruitment of policy leaders. We sort of talked about science policy or being science policy adjacent, but I think it's important to remember that, well, a lot of the people that will come through RPL will end up in policy positions. It is possible to use RPL to be in sort of more technical positions, although there can be some sort of limitations there. And so for me, because I manage a team right now, I spend a lot of time working with my team members and making sure that they have the resources that they need to do their jobs. But a lot of the other work that I do is developing some science advice, working on briefings or memos for senior management, developing submissions for cabinet for new funding proposals. But I also spend a fair amount of time just staying on top of the literature and working with external partners to develop scientific projects that we fund through external contribution programs, as well as organizing a lot of engagement sessions with various stakeholders. So we do a lot of consultation and outreach as well. So the days can be pretty mixed, I would say. And even in some cases when I was sort of in a substantive where I was working specifically on freshwater habitat science, I would also spend a lot of time just talking with research scientists and understanding their projects and figuring out ways that I could facilitate their science. So a lot of oral communication, informal conversations, you know, getting up to speed on different projects. So really varied work, I would say.
Great, Rajat. And I'll invite panelists, if you want to take 2, 3 at once in terms of the questions to help us go through them, feel free. We might also answer a few in writing as well, just to make sure we give as much info as we can. So Rajat.
I'll just take, well, first again, I'll copy the question that Amanda had just answered on what your day-to-day looks like. It depends so much based on where you work. Even for me, working the same sector so far, I've had 3 different positions and they've all been different. The first was, well, I guess first was research outreach. So I worked on a little bit on infrastructure, Canada Foundation for Innovation, a little bit on actual tri-council programming, worked as NSERC liaison, tried to work on the transition of the Networks of Centers of Excellence program to the new Frontiers in Research program. After that, I took a position in contributions, where I actually looked at how the federal government gives money to third-party research organizations, including the Institute for Quantum Computing, the Perimeter Institute. My tax is actually on the list of contributions, although I don't handle that one. Currently, I'm working on a team, well, I'm working on 2 teams, but I'm working on a team that deals a lot with federal infrastructure, federal science, so the NRC, National Research Council. We do a lot of external engagement, not only with third-party organizations, other organizations in the portfolio like the Business Development Bank of Canada, other ministries like Global Affairs. It's a mixed bag who you're advising. Some days you're advising senior management. We actually set lines up for the Prime Minister last week. I think I actually was lucky that I was actually the one that actually got to pen the Nobel Prize congratulatory letters. So I got to pen those. And I did put a lot of direct subject matter expertise in there, but I think I'll just say it got taken out when it got up the chain. I won't say too much about that. But just moving on to the next question, I think there's some questions directly related to the CVs. So I think one question was, what is the format for the resume? Is it academic, like 6 to 10 pages, or is it best to summarize? So I would push this as 2, and maybe if Leticia has a different view, she can jump in. But for applying to the RPL, it is good to demonstrate your academic expertise. In that case, you know, having your publications that are major publications, you know, there's some merit criteria for that. When you're actually looking for a job afterwards, if you're successful, please do not use the same CV, because most departments are generally, for policy positions, at least in my experience, not that keen per se on the exact number of publications that you have. And those CVs aren't really academic, a little bit more focused towards government. So you can keep your 6 to 10 page CV, but I would realize that you're applying to a policy position. So as in academia, you would start with maybe your education, your publications, and you list your leadership activities at the end. I might flip that. I might start with the policy relevant experience you have, broadly what your academic experience is, you know, without necessarily going through every single poster presentation that you've done. I found that the most helpful for at least the RPL mentees that I've had as well. The next question actually deals with the application too, and this might have changed. So if this has changed, Leticia, please jump in. But talking about how the space is unlimited for sharing our literacy and policy experience and for highlighting our significant contributions. So when I wrote the application, that's what I thought. But there actually is, at least when I had done it, there was actually a word limit, which is quite large, but I did run up against it and have to truncate. So for those who are especially, you know, with a lot of achievement, which I think is most of you in this audience, it would behoove you to start off with less and then start adding and prioritize strategically what you want to highlight, which I think is a good, you know, good piece of advice anyway. And then really highlight what's important about it, as opposed to ancillary details. So for instance, you have a publication. This paper in nanotechnology enabled the creation of XYZ, which solved this outstanding problem that could lead to something or the other. You don't have to say that. Really, you would probably just say it was a top tier journal on something, and then just go to the very end of what it could possibly implicate. So I think some sort of truncation or self-censoring is probably a good idea. So I think I'll leave that.
Great, and I might just add a few pointers for CV or the application. So you're right, the CV. Well, basically the CV, for starters, in the application, we barely look at it. It's really there because the system is such that it allows you to add your CV to your application. But what we evaluate is really your answer to the 3 pre-selection questions. So how you meet academic excellence, how you meet policy experience, and leadership and community involvement. We won't be reading between the lines of your CV to try to see how your experience might match. We're really asking you to tell us upfront. So the CV in your application, not really used, and the one later, you'll have an opportunity, as Rajat said, to discuss perhaps with your mentor. If you're successful, you're about to look for opportunities. Publications, we might hold them close to our heart and be really proud, but in government, even as someone from the social sciences who didn't have as extensive a record, I was advised to, put it in an annex, and that was someone's way of telling me that they won't look at it anyways, because that's not necessarily what's most important, I suppose. Same thing about including impact factors and the like. You better really explain and say, in plain language for a non-specialist what it means, or that it was one of the top 10 journals in the field, rather than providing an impact factor that might not be that telling to others. Donc, juste en français, parce que c'est un point important, votre CV, il y a une portion dans l'application en ligne pour l'inclure. Par contre, on regarde le CV à peine. C'est vraiment une source secondaire. On va vraiment évaluer votre candidature à partir de vos réponses aux 3 questions de présélection. Donc, vraiment, montrez-nous comment vous rencontrez les critères. On ne va pas aller essayer de lire entre les lignes là, dans le fond de votre CV. Puis pour le CV, ensuite, là, une fois que si vous êtes retenu dans le bassin, puis vous cherchez des opportunités, il va y avoir une occasion là, à ce moment-là de réviser votre CV. Puis c'est vrai que les publications prennent une importance un peu moindre quand on cherche un poste au gouvernement. As for the length of text boxes, be as comprehensive as you can to meet the required information. So for your experience, it's actually right there. If you read on top of each box, it will tell you the format we'd like your answer in, and then what to include. So the duration of your experience, what were your roles, your contributions. So all those elements, as long as they're covered, it should be fine. If you want to, make our lives easier by making one paragraph for each one of those experiences or key blocks, that would be helpful to review. We don't want you to sell yourself short, but at the same time, you have to put yourself in the shoes of people who are reviewing a lot of these. So everything you can do to make it easier and clearer for us to identify that, yes, indeed, you do have this experience that we're looking for is going to be welcome. Oui, donc je vais juste dire ça en français, puis je passe à toi ensuite. Donc, pour l'application aussi, il n'y a pas nécessairement de limite de texte là, où elle est très longue, mais vraiment, on vous encourage à lire les instructions détaillées. On vous dit clairement ce qu'on veut dans chaque section, la durée de votre expérience, par exemple, vos réalisations, vos contributions, quel rôle vous avez joué. Donc, si vous rencontrez tout ça, c'est ce qu'on veut. Pas besoin nécessairement de trop en mettre, mais aussi si vous pouvez structurer avec, par exemple, un paragraphe pour chacun des éléments clés, tout ce qui peut aider les gens qui vont évaluer plusieurs candidatures à vraiment être capables d'identifier si vous rencontrez nos critères. Alors, Sean.
J'allais juste dire rapidement, pour sauter sur ce que tu viens de dire, Laetitia, si dans la boîte pour l'expérience académique, vous faites juste une liste de tous les articles que vous avez publiés, même si vous avez 25 articles en première hauteur, ça dit pas grand-chose, nécessairement, surtout si la personne qui va faire le review de votre application connaît aucunement votre domaine. Et beaucoup de personnes ne savent pas vraiment ce qu'une mesure d'impact d'un journal veut vraiment dire, ou si un journal à impact 5 ou 12 est vraiment différent. You can actually have a lot more impact in that section by, like Rajat said, describing the actual, quality of that journal, how important it is in the field that you're in, But if you can also describe something like, I optimized the methodology for, a big facility at the university that ended up contributing to a lot of other work for a lot of other labs, you can actually show that you're having impact in a lot of other ways that's maybe a little less expected than just, I have 6 papers and one of them is in Cell. Try to be as descriptive as possible there. And if I can answer 2 other questions here that I mentioned. Somebody asked, how do you get government organization experience as a postdoc, even if you satisfy other requirements of the program? Assuming you're currently in a postdoc, you probably don't have a tremendous amount of time. What I would suggest is just get involved with organizations that already do work at the intersection of policy. There's a lot of them out there. The one I was a part of was Science and Policy Exchange, but if you're a postdoc, there's a Canadian Association of Postdoctoral Fellows that engages with the federal government. You can volunteer with them in your off hours. And the list goes on quite a bit longer than that. And somebody asked, I see you all worked for a brief period prior to acceptance to the RPL, even with the PhD. I applied before I finished my PhD, but I was essentially volunteering in the science policy space during my PhD. So like another place is you could volunteer with the Canadian Science Policy Conference or some of these other areas in which it might not take up a huge amount of your time, but you can start wrapping your head around what are some key topics in science policy, what are a lot of the kind of big players in the field, whether they're in government or in academia or in industry, what do they care about? What's the really big topics for the coming year that people are thinking about? Just get out there and start to understand what the active discussion is in science policy. And that's only going to help you once you actually get to the interview phase of the process for RPL.
Great, thanks. Margot?
Yeah, I think I saw the question about that some fields of study are not as explicitly favored. I also came from a field that was animal sciences, generally not very well funded and not of major national interest. So I wouldn't be discouraged if you're from a field that doesn't get a lot of national attention or doesn't get a lot of funding priorities. I think it's, as many people said, it's up to you to convince the people who are reading your application that what you do has value in your field and sort of give them the explanation of why that's the case. So I wouldn't be too worried about exactly how your credentials look on paper, how it compares to other people, but just that you can really draw that narrative. I would also say, because there were some questions about as the process goes on, I would say, there hasn't been a lot of discussion about the interview, but I think some people said it as a stress style interview. They will not, at least in my experience, ask you anything about your background. You really need to be prepared to demonstrate, both in the writing sample and in the interview, that you are able to respond calmly and thoughtfully to questions that are being posed of you in a very short period of time. You need to have a basic kind of toolkit in your pocket of topics that you are comfortable discussing, things that you truly believe passionately, and I think it is better if you really believe it, should be national priorities, what the sort of conflicting interests are in Canada between national and regional priorities and provincial priorities. I think these are things that would benefit you. So I would do that reflecting on your own work and on things that you're passionate about, but know that what they are really trying to assess as the application goes on, even though the initial screening process is really about your background, what they are really trying to assess as you proceed is how calmly and thoughtfully and intelligently you can respond to questions that are being asked of you, that in many cases in your job, you will be asked questions that you don't know the answer to. And it is your job to find those answers and communicate that well. So it's a bit hard to say as things go forward. I know the interview changes every year. I think the writing requirements or assignment has also changed since I applied, but I would say try to stick to something that you are comfortable with so that you have a lot to say and you can speak about it passionately, but also be aware that the content of what you yourself have studied and believe really passionately about is not something that your interviewers or your assessors are comfortable with. And that is also to your benefit because you can demonstrate a lot of competence without necessarily being married to the subject matter, which is great.
Great, thank you so much. I think a lot of the remaining questions are a bit more general about the process, the program or the process. So I'll try to have a go as we wrap up. So the application, just to give you a brief overview from here on, the applicants who will be successful at screening stage will be invited to the written exam, which is a briefing note, but we do give you a very clear template and very clear instructions about what it should look like. So, you know, we do hire externally. We know people might not have the slightest clue what it looks like, but we give you the tools and a fictional scenario, and we rely on you to produce policy recommendations on that basis. Then from then on, the ones that are successful in the exam will be invited to an interview. And it's important to mention, as Margot was alluding to, both the written exam and the interview are the same for all RPL candidates, no matter their background. Social sciences, humanities, literature, or pure sciences, everyone gets through the same process. Therefore, you probably will not be able to leverage your science-specific or field expertise. It's really one that's looking for breadth and depth of knowledge of the public policy landscape and main challenges. So it's true that you might be tempted to stay in your comfort zone, but I can assure you that the interview panel will purposely try to break that shell and bring you elsewhere. And I'd recommend that you be able to engage on other topics than your own, because otherwise it might actually be a reason why you wouldn't make it through. Because we're looking for people who we might be able to place in a variety of government departments and for them to be able to actually swim when we throw them in the deep end, no matter where almost. Donc, vraiment important, à la fois l'examen écrit puis l'entrevue, c'est vraiment pour des gens de tous les champs. Donc, vous n'allez pas nécessairement être capable de mettre en valeur votre expertise pointue scientifique. Donc, c'est vraiment important de garder l'esprit ouvert puis de vous tenir à jour aussi sur les priorités du moment. So, how to do that? You can look at Speech from the Throne, at budgets, or just keep up with the news really of like the main national priorities of the time. And then we had a question about an applicant tracking system or whether there's a computer generated like sorting that happens. There's only one step that's done through there, and I'll let you in on a little secret. Basically, for each pre-selection question, do you have academic excellence? Do you have policy relevant experience? And do you have leadership community involvement experience? Those three require you to answer yes or no. If you say no, the system will not consider you further. So that's the main sorting that's done automatically. Apart from that, it's really reviewers who will actually score for those people who do meet those three criteria, or at least do say that they meet them. So basically, if you don't meet those criteria, it's not even worth applying because they're essential qualifications. But then if you do meet them, it's important to explain to us how you do, because then it will be a qualitative in a way evaluation of how much and how deep is your commitment or your experience. And finally, a note on citizenship. So you might have seen on the website, it's also the case for a lot of Government of Canada job postings. So there's a preference to Canadian veterans and Canadian citizens in that order. And in previous years, we have managed to form the pool from Canadian citizens. That said, if you're in the process of obtaining your citizenship, you can always update your profile on the GC Jobs portal. Donc, pour la citoyenneté, si vous ne l'avez pas encore, il y a une préférence, comme c'est écrit sur l'offre d'emploi, pour les vétérans et les citoyens canadiens. Toutefois, si en cours de processus, vous obtenez votre citoyenneté, vous pouvez l'indiquer, l'ajouter à votre dossier. So thank you so much. I think it was great to hear from all our scientists or science adjacent policies and expertise here, experts on this panel. If you want more information, or if you look through the application and you have more generic questions on the program or on the next steps, we have webinars on these more general topics next week. So you can register for those, or also look at our generic YouTube videos. And the important date to remember is November 9th. To apply. So that's the deadline for this year's campaign in 2020. I'll mention it in case this video lives longer than this year's campaign. Donc, juste en français pour terminer, si vous avez des questions sur le processus plus général, si vous commencez votre application, vous avez des questions, on a d'autres webinaires, y compris des sessions là, spécifiquement en français, qui vont être entièrement en français au courant de la semaine prochaine. Donc, vous pouvez vous inscrire. Puis, si vous voulez de l'information aussi plus générale, on a des vidéos là, sur YouTube qui vous parlent du programme. Mais c'était très apprécié d'avoir les collègues ici pour leur expertise dans des postes de politique scientifique ou qui ont utilisé, dans le fond, leur parcours en sciences pour entrer au gouvernement par le biais du RLP. Donc, un gros merci à tous. J'espère que vous avez trouvé la session utile et meilleurs vœux. Les applications sont ouvertes jusqu'au 9 novembre, November 9th for applications. Thank you all.
Merci. Bon courage.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.